All right, now joined for the first time in a little while by Glenn Greenwald. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Ben. It's great to see you. Always enjoy talking to you, and I appreciate your inviting me on.
Yeah, always. So yeah, I mean, I wanted to talk to you about a couple of things, but I mean, first, just to set this up a little bit, there's been this there's been a lot of controversy in the last week or two, particularly about this alleged wave of anti-Semitism on college campuses that's been used to justify pushes for more censorship than there has been before, and this kind of goes with a sort of general trend towards cracking down on pro-Palestinian speech, which is not new at all, right? But is certainly intensified, since October. So I guess I just wanted to like start off by just getting your sense of what's been going on there and how bad it's been.
I think you can make the argument that the last 2 months in the United States, so basically since the October 7th attack in Israel by Hamas, have been two of the greatest months ever for the cause of censorship and what the right has been calling cancel culture, and just a general framework of victimhood narratives being exploited to justify limitations on free expression. And obviously, there's a huge irony to it, which is that oftentimes it is being led by the very people who have spent years denouncing censorship and cancel culture, and not just denouncing it, but building extremely lucrative media platforms where they branded themselves free speech warriors. Now, it's always been the case, as you alluded to in your question, that there has been an Israel exception to the right's conception of freedom of speech for a long, long time. I've been doing a lot of reporting on all the various ways that pro-Palestinian voices or Israel critics have been fired and censored and punished, not just in informal ways, but very formal ways. We've had a lot of red state legislatures and governors enacting laws that require people as a condition for employment with the state to vow that they don't support a boycott of Israel. You can boycott whatever state you want in the United States. You can boycott whatever foreign country you want, just not Israel. Obviously, courts have found that unconstitutional, but it got a lot of support. But the emotions surrounding October 7th have been so high. I mean, in some ways, I think a lot of people in the United States have reacted more intensely than they even did to the 9/11 attack on their own country, given the immense importance religiously or culturally or politically that Israel plays in their public imagination. But I think as well that there has been I think some people on the right like to pretend that they're only supporting censorship as a sort of tit for tat to finally make the American left live under the censorship framework that they have imposed on everyone else. And the reason why it's just not the case is because it's not as though censorship of Israel critics began only in the last 2 months. I think these people genuinely believe that the only real victim group in the United States are not Black people or trans people or LGBTs or immigrants or Muslims, only are American Jews, and that therefore censorship is required to ensure that American Jews once again can feel safe on campus. Just such an ironic way that they've embraced every left liberal theory that they've spent years pretending to loathe when applied to other groups.
Yeah, I mean, like to the point that I feel like I've heard the word safety with regards to college students feeling unsafe more times in the last few weeks than I maybe have in the last couple of years before that. And of course, this is exactly the kind of thing that would inspire the most eye rolling, from a lot of these same quarters if it were any other subgroup of college students. And to be clear, I would co-sign, right, the eye rolling, right,
Right, as would I.
those other cases, right? But
Right.
it's but somehow here, I mean, like you literally have, I mean, I think there was a day of news cycles about the Yale cafeteria, whoever puts the names on the trays of food briefly changing the Israeli couscous salad with spinach and tomatoes to couscous salad with spinach and tomatoes, which like I think there's so little like real fire to go with all the smoke, that like even that had to be turned into something, right? For a day to sort of prop up this narrative. And this is I mean, I guess on the one hand, um like kind of taking a step back from some of the immediate free speech issues to the bigger question. You alluded earlier to the comparison with 9/11, and if you think about the way that this is played out in the United States, at least, compared to 9/11, in certain in certain respects, I think you're right. I mean, like this is actually this is actually worse in terms of the sort of intensity of demonization of some dissenting voices. But on the other hand, there is a lot more dissent about support for Israel's military response to October 7th than there was to the invasion of Afghanistan, for example, right? So Barbara Lee famously was the only person in Congress who voted against this. Now voted against the authorization of the use of military force after 9/11. And now you do have quite a few people in Congress, small minority of the institution as a whole, but like certainly quite a few, given that comparison, who want a ceasefire in Israel Palestine. And I guess the other thing I kind of wanted to see what you thought about is like how that kind of feeds into your sense of foreign policy realignment, right? Because I know you and I talked about this with Branko Marcetic back in January, and in that case, we were mostly talking about Ukraine, where where the sort of dissenting faction on U.S. policy, is pretty much entirely Republicans. There was briefly like a flash of something from the Congressional Progressive Caucus, but they like backed away from it immediately. But in this case, it's the opposite, right? I mean, you don't see any Republicans that I've seen, certainly politicians currently holding office who've broken from the consensus on pouring arms and money into Israel's assault on Gaza. Uh, I haven't, I mean, I certainly haven't noticed any flicker of that, from that quarter, even though, you could argue that, even though, you and I certainly both support, you know, ceasefire, peace negotiations in Ukraine. Also, it's like the anti-war case seems to be, in certain respects, much stronger in this case because I mean, Russia actually did invade Ukraine, whereas in this case, the United States is pouring guns and money, into an occupying power. And so I guess I was just wondering how this kind of played into how you think about the sort of alignment of the parties when it comes to foreign policy, and whether there has been any sort of genuine realignment on these questions.
So just a couple things. I don't at all disagree with your overall characterization of Republicans being almost entirely supportive of funding Israel's wars.
Mhm.
And you could see this coming a mile away. I mean, we used to have, I had a lot of members of Congress on my show over the last year who were opposed to the war in Ukraine. And they would say things like, we have too many problems at home. We can't afford to fund foreign wars. Ukraine's not the 51st American state. And I would always follow that up with, well, what about Israel? Does your rationale apply to funding Israel's wars as well? Because we give that country $4 billion a year. And whenever they want to bomb Gaza or have a new war, we fund them as well. And they would say, oh, no, Israel's totally different. So there's always been this obvious and glaring exception, just like there is for free speech on the right for Israel for the anti-interventionist case. But I just want to correct, not really correct, but just in case you
Sure.
don't know, There is actually a member of Congress, Thomas Massey from Kentucky, who has gone to war with AIPAC. He was on my show 2 weeks ago, and when I asked him on my show, I wanted to talk about AIPAC, but I wasn't sure if he wanted to. And he basically said, I want to come on to talk about AIPAC. And he is a vehement opponent of aid to Israel. He's a vehement opponent of the idea that the United States should make Israel's wars our wars. He has been targeted by AIPAC with over $100,000 in negative ads in his district. They're trying to recruit a primary challenger to run against him in Kentucky based on this Israel view. And in his case, he's in a district in Kentucky that's filled with evangelical voters for whom Israel is very important. It is not a risk-free position that he's taking. So, and then also, I would also just add that you have Vivek Ramaswamy, who, call him what you want, a major candidate. He's kind of been vacillating. He's certain in the first tier, one of the four left, in addition to Trump, still standing, who has also said he's opposed to Biden's request for $14 billion more for Israel. And he sometimes couches it in this idea that the way I've actually seen a lot of neocons and a lot of hardcore Israel fanatics like Jacob Siegel at Tablet, who a few months ago wrote an article saying we should end U.S. aid to Israel because he thinks it constrains Israel. He wants Israel to go bomb Iran and, kill even more Palestinians. And he sees U.S. aid as something tying their hands behind their back. And so he's opposed it on that ground. So Vivek is saying we shouldn't be funding Israel's wars. We can't give them fortune. So there are a couple of notable exceptions in the Republican Party, but by and large, overwhelmingly, there is no sense at all of this anti-war, anti-interventionist sentiment that we've seen, not just with Ukraine, but, in general, I think in the Republican Party. Now, I also just want to say that I'm not entirely sure that I agree with you that there's more dissent when it comes to Iraq, when it comes to this current war with Israel than there was with Iraq. Remember that, 2/3 of House Democrats voted against the war in Iraq and half of the Democratic caucus voted against the war in Iraq. But so you do have Democrats.
By Iraq there certainly wasn't with the invasion of Afghanistan right after 9/11.
For sure. No, it was just Barbara Lee. But I'm just saying, you do have Democrats making noises now, about, we're a little concerned about Israel being excessive. But when it came time to vote, the only people who voted against Israel's aid besides Thomas Massey were about 7 Democrats, and maybe like 9 or 10. It's not a substantial minority even, because Israel is always a different case. For one thing, the power of the Israel lobby has few rivals, maybe like the Wall Street lobby, the pharmaceutical lobby, the military industrial complex. But, the Mearsheimer and Walt book from 2006 very much still applies. I had them both on my show, and I said, has much changed? And they were like, no, if anything, the Israeli lobby has gotten even a little stronger. On top of that, the cause of Israel has now skyrocketed in priorities to not just American evangelicals, but worldwide evangelicals. I mean, the Brazilian right is obsessed with Israel on evangelical grounds. The very first thing Bolsonaro did when he got elected, the next day that he got elected president of Brazil, he flew to Tel Aviv. He got baptized in the Jordan River, but he met with Israeli security services. And you see all these right-wing leaders like Milei in Argentina, who danced around with an Israeli flag draped over him, and Geert Wilders in Holland, who just had this election victory. He has a flag of the Netherlands right next to the Israeli flag. He's married to an Orthodox Jewish woman. So, Israel has a huge pull, obviously, on American Jews, but then also on evangelicals who make a much bigger faction in the United States. And then as well as like national security hawks who see Israel as an important military partner to dominate the region. And when you put all that together on top of the Israel lobby, there's always an exception for Israel with pretty much everything. I mean, votes for years that go before the Congress about Israel passed by like 422-9. Like the most lopsided majorities ever. So to the extent you're asking me whether I think this proves that this skepticism of the anti-interventionism in the Republican Party is genuine or not, I would say yes and no. It does prove that they make a huge exception for Israel, and none of their principles that they say they believe in about foreign policy can be reconciled with their eagerness to defend and fund Israel's wars. That's for sure. It's irreconcilable. I just think that Israel is such a singular obsession for so many people in the United States, especially on religious grounds and cultural grounds. And then you still have a lot of this lingering I think maybe more than I realized. After 9/11, there was that thesis like we were in a civilizational war.
Mhm.
That was like the Samuel Harrington critique that it's not the United States against Al Qaeda, it's the West against the primitive hordes of savage Muslims. And the one thing I think George W. Bush deserves credit for is he tried to tamp that down. I think
Mhm.
because of the influence of his father, if you may remember, the week after 9/11, he went to mosques and met with imams and said, we're not at war with Muslims. But there was still a lot of right wing sentiment that just, they don't care about Israel. They don't care about the geopolitics of it. They just think Muslims are this horde, this enemy invader in Western Europe, and now more so in the United States, who just need to be killed. And there's a lot of that as well going on. So you're right, Israel, what they're doing and saying on this war in Israel is completely inconsistent with any conception of anti-interventionism. It's just something that I've always seen and pointed out. But I don't think it necessarily means that all of their
Mhm.
anti-interventionism is a fraud.
Right. I got you. Yeah, I mean, it is striking though that, that like this is something that, a lot of the same, in different forms, right? A lot of the same concerns, would apply to as with Russia, Ukraine. Certainly, the danger of spilling out into a larger war. Um, not in this instance a war between nuclear powers, but even so, right? That you would have that I mean, certainly, Netanyahu has been pushing, for a bigger war with Hezbollah and Lebanon that could, I mean, Iran, right?
Even Iran, yeah.
Yeah, that's a real possibility, which is which would be anybody who ended up supporting that. I mean, that really would be quite a reversal of the whole premise of like kind of post Bush era anti-interventionism, really by anybody, right? But like but also on the right, right? That at this point, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were so obviously disastrous that it's like everybody almost is sort of retroactively opposed to those. But even if they weren't at the time, and I hear a lot of people sort of bashing neocons in even like from really wildly different ideological premises, right? Like even after Henry Kissinger died, right? I saw people running this like sort of rehabilitation of Kissinger based on, oh, well, at least he was a realist, not like those awful neocons. And this is, but anybody who takes that sort of posture that oh well these neoconservatives were horrible with their support for these endless wars in the Middle East. I mean, it would be absolutely incredible if they ended up now potentially supporting a war with Iran, which would sort of complete the grisly tic-tac-toe that Bush started with Iraq and Afghanistan, and also, by the way, it would probably be much worse than those wars because Iran is much more of a real country with a real military than the Taliban or Saddam Hussein's Iraq were at the time that those wars started.
Right. I mean, Iran is 3 times the size of Iraq, just in terms of population, a much more sophisticated military, much more dangerous to have a war against. I think that's why it hasn't happened. And I just guess I would say that if it did happen, it wouldn't be because Republicans who are hypocrites on anti-interventionism made it happen. It would be because Joe Biden
Sure.
either did it or endorsed it or permitted it.
Hmm.
Um, but the one thing I just want to say though
Sure.
is this like idea of anti-interventionism on the right.
Yeah.
It did find its greatest expression in the last few years because when it came to the war between Russia and Ukraine, because that was the main foreign policy conflict that we've been dealing with. But there's always been a strain, a genuine strain in the Republican Party against interventions that don't seem to be directly related to US national security. One of the most vocal critics and one of the most insightful ones of the invasion of Iraq and the whole idea of neoconservatism back in 2002 and 2003 was Pat Buchanan and the paleocons. But I think the vivid example is the success that Ron Paul had when he was running in 2008, 2012, because he wasn't only against all of these regime change wars. Not only did he rant and rave against neocons, he said the United States bears blame for 9/11 because we were interfering way too much in the world. And he was even opposed to things like sanctions on Cuba and Venezuela and countries like this on the grounds that we're interfering in those countries to try and change the government. We're immiserating the populations. We're restricting our own trade. And Ron Paul had a lot of success with that message in, Iowa and South Carolina. And I think Donald Trump recognized that and seized on it. You needed a much more charismatic figure than Ron Paul was, but already Ron Paul was there demonstrating it existed and it was kind of lurking. Remember that a lot of Republicans, a lot of the American right, were opposed to Bill Clinton's adventures in the Balkans. They hated Madeleine Albright for, that whole obsession that she had with bombing Serbia. When George Bush ran for president in 2000 against Al Gore, the foreign policy critique was, you're too arrogant. You interfered in too much part of the world. We need a more humble foreign policy. Obviously, 9/11 changed that. And then even going back to the regime change war in Libya, which President Obama deserves the blame for, but he actually kind of got pushed and shoved reluctantly into it by people like Hillary Clinton and other hardcore liberal interventionists. The majority of the House Republican caucus voted no on the war in Libya. Donald Trump ran against the regime change war in Syria, saying it's insane that we're, doing this sort of thing. And then even when, Trump was the first American president in decades not to involve the U.S. in a new war, even though he escalated the civilian killings of the war he inherited, like the bombing campaign in Syria and Iraq. And then when he got close occasionally, like bombing General Soleimani in Iran, people like Tucker Carlson stood up and said, what Trump did here and trifling with a potential war with Iran is very wrong, even while you had a bipartisan mainstream media and political class in Washington largely supportive of that strike on Iran. So all I say is I'm disgusted by the conservatives who are supporting this war in Israel. You have a few exceptions, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Vivek, people like that, but overwhelmingly they're supportive of it. It makes me sick for so many reasons. Morally, politically, it's a violation of everything that they're saying. I just want to caution a little bit about drawing the conclusion that this means there's no real anti-interventionism in the Republican Party, at least on the populist right that Trump represents, except for Ukraine, because I think we've seen it finding vehicles of expression in other conflicts as well. It's just that Israel people lose their minds. I think they venerate Israel. A lot of Americans do, including people on the American right who claim that they're America first advocates. They venerate Israel. They care more about Israel than they even do the United States. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I think that's a fair point. I mean, it's certainly, certainly the case, right? You said a minute ago that if a war in Iran happens, right, it's going to be because of Joe Biden, which is certainly true if it happens the next year, right? That's while Biden is president, right? He might very well not be after that, and we would see with Trump, right? I mean, like, this is kind of the subject of our last big conversation, the sort of gap between that sort of Ron Paulish energy that Trump was for sure like tapping into in his campaign and the actual ways that he governed in many ways. But I guess the one maybe it is, as we start to wrap this up a little bit, like, one thing I was curious is you said a few minutes ago that, okay, so there's this widespread, in addition to the Israel sort of the special status of Israel for many Americans, even who are not really on the right, who are centrist or whatever, but certainly for a lot of the ones who are, for evangelicals who are probably actually at this point more uniformly, are closer to being uniformly pro-Israel than American Jews. I think if you look at, I saw a poll from 2021 that you have like 1 out of 3 American Jews under the age of 40 agreed with the sentence that Israel is an apartheid state, which, is certainly, despite the, uniform support for Israel on an institutional level within, American Jewish communal institutions is certainly a big change. But okay, so besides the special status for Israel, there's also this widespread sentiment on much of the right that Muslims are this civilizational enemy, and of course that's something that Trump was also tapping into when he ran the first time. That when he advocated complete ban on all Muslims from anywhere coming into the U.S. Until we figure out what's going on, and then made some attempts to partially implement some version of that while in office. So I mean, he's certainly like that was in fact like a important issue for him. And so I guess it's I mean, if the question is where in mainstream American politics, right, where we're calling mainstream, like at least there are a few people in Congress who represent it, do you find consistent anti-interventionism? I'm sure we would agree the answer is like nowhere, right? Pretty much, right? That they have that like.
Yeah, I mean, Ron Paul was an example, actually. Maybe Thomas Massey is. Just if you listen to that interview I did with him, there's a lot of Ron Paul principles lurking in there, and he's risking his career by defying AIPAC, like in casting these lone votes. But I agree with you entirely. It's very rare, and the thing about Trump is, I can point you to a lot of statements he made that I think are good and positive that even people on the left would like, and the argument is very valid. Oh, well, he said these things, but they weren't reflected in his actions and his policies.
Yeah,
and
I mean, I can point you even that Obama said in 2008 that were good on
of course, yeah, every president, right? So he said, hey, let's get along with Russia, which I think is a good thing. We should try and get along with the world's largest nuclear power, the country with whom we almost twice at least came close to causing nuclear Armageddon on the planet. But then as soon as he gets into office, he's arming Ukraine with lethal weapons, something that Obama refused to do. And he bombed Syria and Assad and got applauded that time. Remember, that was when the media was saying, oh, Donald Trump really became president tonight. And then he also did everything he could to sabotage Nord Stream 2, which was crucial to the future economic prosperity of Russia and its ability to sell cheap natural gas to Europe. So there was this disparity between the good thing he said and the bad things he did. Conversely, though, there were bad things that he said that often also didn't end up manifesting in policy. And I'll just give you one example. Like, it's obvious now that the right-wing base wants to hear transphobia. They want to hear trans people mocked. They want to hear, the idea that like transitioning is freakish and we should, treat as criminals people who do it to minors. Trump has made clear all the time that he doesn't care about trans people at all. In 2016, they said, would you have trans people on your cabinet? He was like, absolutely. Trump doesn't care about like LGBT issues. He's not religious. He fakes this. He pretends it to manipulate right-wing voters. And
I mean, he
we
did
do have a record. I do believe I do believe he's bigoted toward Muslims. I don't think that's fake. But we have 4 years of, when he was the most pro-Israel president ever, including moving the embassy to Jerusalem, which didn't turn into a scandal because Chuck Schumer stood up and said, I support President Trump's decision. But we do have 4 years of a record. And for all the kind of anti-Islam and anti-Muslim sentiment and animosity that he triggered, it is true that he inherited a bombing campaign in Iraq and Syria that he escalated, that he promised he would do during the campaign, saying, I want to destroy ISIS, killed a lot of civilians. But other than that, it's not like he went around starting wars with Arab or Muslim countries, even though it probably would have been politically advantageous for him to do so, just because every time there's a new war, the country unites behind a president. So it's a complex question, because you have Biden saying all the loveliest things about the value of Muslim life and is giving the green light to one of the most horrific things I've ever seen, which is the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. Not that Trump would do any different, but I'm just saying, like, nice rhetoric doesn't
Mhm.
always mean good policy, but malevolent rhetoric doesn't always mean bad policy. And I obviously wouldn't recommend voting for Trump if the issue you care about most is Israel and Palestine, because he's never going to be better than Biden. It might even be worse. On the other hand, you have a record of 4 years, which for whatever reason, Ben, it is just true. You have Biden heavily involved in the war in Ukraine, which wasn't true before he was elected. You have him heavily involved in this war in Gaza, which wasn't true before he was elected. And Trump just didn't involve the U.S. in new wars. And I think in Trump's mind, not only is that a source of pride, like he likes being able to say, I didn't start any new wars. In Trump's mind, he thinks it's proof of his strength that he's so like threatening and so unhinged that
Mhm.
countries want to do deals with the United States. This is what Trump believes. And on some level, I mean, I think there's a little bit of truth to it in the sense that he just, for all the predictions that we're going to be involved in nuclear war with North Korea, he was seeking a war with Iran. None of that actually happened. And I think there is something about Trump and his very twisted and bizarre way of approaching the world and thinking about things that is a factor in why.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly. I mean, it is a little bit complicated because he was president for one term. Obama was president for two. Didn't certainly didn't start any of this in the second one. Toward the end of the first one, there was the crisis in Libya, and as you say, he did end up getting pushed into intervening there. If Trump had been president when Russia invaded Ukraine, I don't know, maybe you disagree with this, but I mean, like, I have absolutely no idea what he would have done, right? Like, I don't have a strong
Right.
feeling about that one way or
Right.
the other,
I
right?
agree. I
Just
agree.
because, like,
But but
he's
but the but the,
he's
but
just
the fact
made a
that
lot of
but the fact that Trump's closest like ideological representatives in Congress
Mhm.
did overwhelmingly vote no, like the Matt Gaetzes, the Marjorie Taylor Greens, the Josh Hawleys, they were all like very hardcore no votes from the beginning, I think does provide at least a clue. And Trump was never on board with saying that. What he really would always say is, "Oh, this wouldn't have happened if I had been president."
Right.
So he never really took a firm position. But the kind of MAGA populists who are most closely aligned
Mhm.
with Trump in the Congress actually cast no votes against it. Now, maybe that's because Biden was president and it was easier, and if Trump had been president, it might have been different. All we can do is speculate about the counterfactual. But yeah, I think I agree with you. It is not known.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly Trump helped get us to that point, right? I mean, like in terms of escalating, U.S. involvement in the civil war in Ukraine, and certainly not coming to any kind of accommodation, with Russia. I mean, I don't. It's a very, like, I'm certainly not going to sit here and make some kind of, like, robust case that what Biden actually did in either of these cases is not as bad as what Trump did, because I don't know that that's the case. And what Biden did is awful, right? Like,
I
it's
mean, yeah, but also like the coup that changed the
yeah,
government in Kiev, which I think was
yeah,
most threatening to Putin, happened under Obama. That was Victoria Nuland and that crowd.
mhm,
And then Kamala Harris went to Ukraine and made a lot of really provocative statements that also I think contributed to it. But in fairness to Trump, he spent his whole presidency being accused of being a Russian agent, and people around him are being prosecuted on suspicions of being Kremlin stooges. So I do think his hands were tied, and he did have to sometimes do things that were more antagonistic to Russia to disprove that narrative than he might have. Like, that was for me, one of the most
yeah.
disturbing things of Russiagate was it created this climate in Washington where everybody was afraid to speak to the Russians.
Yeah, which was quite a reversal over, because, like, in during, as you say, the uprising, coup, whatever you want to call it, Maidan happened under Obama, but at the time, right, the overwhelming Republican narrative was that he was soft on
Yep.
Russia. That he got a lot of flack for not sending heavier weaponry to Ukraine. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and Trump, so which by the way, why I know that is because that was pointed out in Glenn Greenwald columns I was reading a few years ago. But in any case, I think this has been good. I'm less optimistic than you are. I think about general anti-interventionism on the right, but it was a good discussion. It's probably a good place to leave it for today.
Yeah, I will certainly concede the last 2 months have been a very strong bolstering of your view, given how bloodthirsty they are. So I will definitely concede that, Ben.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks for
All
coming
right,
on,
great talking to you. Absolutely,
Thanks.
always good, always a pleasure. Bye.
Bye. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.